Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Kevin McMenamin with Loss Prevention Magazine. With me today is my partner in crime, Jack Britton, also with Loss Prevention Magazine. How you doing, Jack?
I'm doing terrific. Another sunny day in Florida.
Yeah, Jack and I are both down in sunny Florida today. We're actually working on an ORC initiative with Clear and putting together some training for law enforcement officers and law enforcement detectives. Pretty exciting project that we're working on here. It has thrown a couple of monkey wrenches into today's session. So a couple of things that we're going to change up on the fly here. A couple of people we're going to move around a little bit with presenters, and a different way that we're going to do some of the presenting today too. But we're still going to get you some really good information, and we're very excited about today's session on Follow the Money, looking at first kind of an inside view within the business when it comes to identifying especially patterns and trends and opportunities with e-commerce and e-fraud, and then looking at how some of those components and elements can come together in a way that can help identify some pretty big cases. When we talk to Todd Eisenhower at Lowe's, who is going to share a pretty significant size case that he had put together at Lowe's, and then we're going to transition over to a few folks from ACAMS and from HSI, and we'll introduce them as we go through it. So let's get started. First and foremost, we want to thank our sponsor, Detective Analytics. Keep in mind when we do these sessions that these sponsors, without them, we just wouldn't be able to do this type of education for you. So please make sure you show them some love. Detective Analytics offers a plug-and-play automated investigations platform that easily connects to your e-com, theft, returns, refunds, and appeasement data to instantly link and uncover thousands of ORC and fraud networks that are stealing millions of dollars from your company's bottom line. The DA platform has built-in technology to proactively stop fraudulent appeasements and refunds in real time. With their latest patents filed just a few days ago, Detective Analytics truly is the state-of-the-art platform for e-com and omni-channel fraud. You're interested? Request a free demo from detectiveanalytics.com, and the platform will instantly uncover 5 million or more in criminal networks that are defrauding your company right now. So there you go. And they're really good people too. I actually met Dean, who owns Detective Analytics. They were the winner of the RELA Technology Awards about 3 years ago, sort of the up and comers, and they've done some really good work in the industry. So please do reach out to Dean. You'll find him great to work with. A big thank you to our education partner, Loss Prevention Foundation. If you have your LPC or LPQ, keep in mind that you get 3 CEU credits for today's session. So thank you very much, Loss Prevention Foundation. Before we get started, if you are not already subscribed to Loss Prevention Magazine, then subscribe today for free. If you go to losspreventionmedia.com, you can get the print magazine sent to your house for free. You can get all of the daily digital assets that we have, as far as digital newsletters and email blasts and news alerts and all the rest of it sent right to your inbox. But if you subscribe to the print magazine, it is free today. It is free tomorrow. It actually is free every day. So, but if you are missing out, you don't have it coming to your home or office, then you are definitely missing out. So please subscribe today. Also download the LP portal. You can find it on Google Play and the Apple App Store. This is your connection to just about everything loss prevention, AP, and safety, with events and information and podcasts and links and news and et cetera, and including ties to a lot of the ORCA, the Organized Retail Crime Associations, and all of their contact information and links to their sites, as well as to Clear and some other great industry initiatives. So download LP Portal today. Also, just to throw it out there for everybody, nominations are closed for the Hall Awards, and we've got some really great nominations this year. We're very excited. Voting opens next week. So keep an eye on lphall.com for the links to get your voting in for LP Leader of the Year and Team of the Year, Investigation of the Year, and so forth. There's a lot of great submissions this year. We're very excited about that. So voting opens next week. Keep an eye on lphall.com, and you'll see the links to be able to get in and get voting. And last but not least, before we get started, so this webinar is being recorded and will be made available in a webinar and a podcast format through losspreventionmedia.com. You'll all be muted. Please submit any questions through the Q&A feature and through the chat feature. And we will try to answer all of your questions, but if we run out of time, we'll still try to get your answers out either directly or via some articles and future webinars through Loss Prevention Magazine and losspreventionmedia.com. So to start off today's session, we're going to start with the, as we said, the inside versus the outside. So we'll start with the inside job of examining opportunities in e-commerce and e-fraud with Professor Adrian Beck, who's an emeritus professor with the University of Leicester in the UK. He's also the sort of founder of Total Retail Loss, if you're familiar with that concept, which a lot of retailers have employed in their businesses. So you may already know the name, but Adrian has been expanding on his typology of loss, particularly around e-commerce and e-fraud. So we're going to talk to Adrian. We're also going to talk with Todd Eisenhower, who is the Director of Investigations and Fraud Prevention for Lowe's. This is one of those monkey wrenches, though, that we got thrown at us. Unfortunately, just the other day, Adrian ended up with a conflict and was not going to be able to be here live. So we've recorded Adrian's session. So if you do have questions for Adrian, I hope you'll still put them in the Q&A. We will still look to get the answers for you. However, Todd is on with us today. We did record Todd's session, but Todd will be on for some live Q&A at the end of the video that we will play next. So without further ado, let's introduce Professor Adrian Beck and Todd Eisenhower. Okay, so for our first session, we want to welcome Professor Adrian Beck and Todd Eisenhower, who is with Lowe's, the Director of Investigations and Fraud Prevention, right, Todd?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, great to have you both here with us today. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Todd.
It's a pleasure.
So, Adrian, let's start with you, right? So we're talking about following the money. We're talking about finding the areas and opportunities for loss within the business. And I know that you've done a tremendous amount of research on this over the years and expanding on the concept of total retail loss that you've grown over the years and that a lot of retailers have picked up on and been using inside their business. But you've also more recently been focused more on the e-commerce and e-fraud side of things, right? And sort of drawing out that typology. Share with us, if you could, what are some of those areas and what are some of the opportunities that retailers should consider looking at and kind of where your research is taking you?
Thanks very much, Kevin. Yes, what I thought I'd do is just perhaps offer a little bit of context to this subject of e-commerce and put my research into a broader bit of context as well. And I think we're all pretty familiar now, aren't we, that we've seen a tremendous growth in the amount of e-commerce, certainly in a number of countries around the world where it's grown really quite quickly. And it was growing before the COVID pandemic, but I think we've really seen the pandemic almost put a rocket underneath e-commerce in some countries where there's simply no other choice for consumers to access goods when lots of the bricks and mortar stores were closed down for a number of months in some countries. And so e-commerce really got a boost through the pandemic. And whilst the amount of e-commerce has gone down a little bit since we've had the opening up in a number of countries, it's still at a much higher level than it was before the pandemic and is now taking a significant proportion of retail sales in a number of countries now. But I think what we've seen within a broader context is that retailing and the issue of retail loss has become a lot more complex to both understand and respond to. And that's one of the reasons why, as you mentioned, I developed the total retail loss idea, which was really trying to get retailers to go beyond just thinking about shrink as the only form of loss that they experience. And, the term shrink has got a very, very long history. It was first used back in the 1860s. So it's got a long history. And I think we can all agree that from the 1860s, retail has changed quite a bit. And therefore, perhaps the requirements of how we understand loss has to change with that retail change as well. And so we've seen, a host of new forms of risks that have emerged within the retail environment. But equally, we've also seen the capability of retailers to understand their losses changing as well, often for the better. It wasn't that long ago when I used to talk about, retailers really living in a data desert, and now it's really gone from a situation of famine to feast, and now it's not necessarily lack of data, but often too much data. And how do you make sense of that data to understand your loss issues? So, I think we've seen this tremendous change in the nature of retail loss. And what e-commerce has done is, I think, broadened that landscape of loss, what we need to begin to understand, because it's brought with it new causes of loss that we simply didn't see in bricks and mortar through the nature of the business of e-commerce. You're now, in some respects, actually delivering product to the consumer's door. That then generates new forms of loss that can occur as a consequence of that. But I think what we also see with e-commerce is that it has really generated more complexity in the retail environment, and particularly when we begin to think about omni-channel, where retailers are offering consumers a range of ways in which they can not only browse, but also purchase and receive and return products to retailers. That's added a high degree of complexity to the retail business. And as we know, one of the challenges with complexity is it generates lots of opportunity for things to go wrong. It's a much more complex environment, which can in itself generate more malicious and indeed non-malicious loss because of that complexity. But I think what we're also going to hear, I think, from, when Todd gives us his example of what happened within his organization, what e-commerce, I think, is doing is it's beginning to change the necessary skill sets of those who are tasked to respond to the issue. It is very much a data-driven part of the retail landscape, and that therefore requires the loss prevention teams to be much more proficient in how they begin to go about understanding that problem, but also the forms of analysis that needs to be done to enable them to develop a more effective way of controlling and managing this issue. And we're certainly seeing now, I think, a growth in new methods of in the way in which the problem of e-commerce can be managed and hopefully controlled more effectively. So, I think I'm just trying to offer a little bit of context here in terms of what we're seeing with the growth of e-commerce and what that is doing in terms of how the loss prevention industry have to respond to that. And just really to give an example of how it's changed, here is the total retail loss typology that I developed in 2016, which, as you can see, is mapped out around different components within the retail environment. So, the retail store, the retail supply chain, e-commerce, and this broader category of corporate, which brought together a whole range of different types of causes of loss. And what's quite interesting here is back in 2016, the retailers I was speaking to help me understand what the key causes of loss were within their organizations. You can see they could really only identify and manageably measure within their organization just two main types of e-commerce losses: those that were malicious in terms of customer frauds, and then the other side of it was the rather darker and more difficult to understand area of credit card chargebacks. They were the two categories that people said that they could measure. And then we moved forward to 2018 when I revisited the total retail loss typology, and you can see that the number of categories that people were now beginning to try and measure and understand within their organization around e-commerce had grown quite considerably. You can see here that the granularity around the different forms of malicious loss is becoming more expansive, but equally on non-malicious as well. There are more types of loss that retailers are now beginning to identify. So you can see this growth in the depth of understanding that retailers are now getting around the issue of e-commerce. You can see there, just in 2 years, from 2016 to 2018. So we're beginning to get a better picture, I think, of understanding how retail organizations have been affected by the issue of e-commerce. And I think what's important here is to understand what we mean by loss, because I think there's been a lot of challenges around trying to agree what we mean by this term shrink, and that's one of the reasons why I developed total retail loss, was to try and get us away from the issues and lack of agreement around what we mean by shrink. And I developed this definition of loss, which was events and outcomes that negatively impact retail profitability. and make no positive, identifiable and intrinsic contribution to generating income. A bit of a mouthful, but essentially what it's trying to capture is to say, we call things a loss when it makes no intrinsic contribution to generating income. Your day as a retailer would only be a better place were you to not experience one of these events. And so what we need to begin to think about in terms of e-commerce and using this loss is, well, how are retail organizations being affected by e-commerce? And as you know, I'm an academic advisor to the ECR Retail Loss Group, and they set up a working group on e-commerce last year. And there we're really beginning to try and develop, first of all, a typology of what are the various causes of e-commerce related losses. Because if you don't know how your organization is being affected by e-commerce, then how can you possibly begin to try and manage that problem? And so the group has been working to try and develop a better typology of the various causes, which I'll share with you in a moment. But also defining what we mean by e-commerce and how we measure that loss, but also trying to start some benchmarking work. How big is this problem? And how is it affecting different parts of the retail sector? And then finally, and I think, critically, I think for retailers, which is, can we begin to start doing some evaluation of approaches and interventions that people are doing to try and manage this more effectively? Where should you be investing to hopefully try and control the problem of e-commerce most effectively? And what I'd just like to share with you is just where we've got to in terms of the typology, just to give you a sense, I think, of increasingly the complexity of this space for retailers. And here you can see this is where we've got to thus far, and it'd be, as I'll finish with my research agenda going forwards. But you can see that it's organized around 4 areas around e-commerce losses that may be generated at the ordering and processing stage of the shopper journey, and they're broken down into malicious and non-malicious forms of loss. And then e-commerce losses that can be generated when the order is being fulfilled and delivered. And there you can see there's a whole tranche of non-malicious ways in which losses can stack up for a retailer. Obviously things like deliveries not being made, parts of deliveries missing, orders not being delivered, in-transit damage, and so on. And then there's this really other third important area around the ways in which e-commerce losses can be generated by the returns process. We're seeing for some retailers that perhaps 40% of their sales will be returned to them, particularly in the apparel world. And that's a really big issue in terms of how you manage those returns and make sure that those returns don't just simply turn into losses. And then the fourth piece is there, as you can see, is around the issue of losses that are associated with the logistics related to your e-commerce activities, particularly around fulfillment centers and distribution centers where it may be going on. And these can be perhaps more predictable around the types of burglaries and internal theft that may go on in those spaces. And certainly for retailers who have originally been in bricks and mortar, like Lowe's, for instance, who now move into e-commerce, this can be a very complicated space, can't it? Because you're actually mixing bricks and mortar and e-commerce together. And some of the logistics may be part of the bricks and mortar, and some of it may be exclusively just for e-commerce. But unpicking that loss can be extraordinarily difficult. And that's where we're trying to get to some degree with this typology, to try and help retailers begin to map out this picture of loss within their organizations. So I'd like to just finish with, Kevin, if I may, is just a real sense of where we're going in terms of research on this issue. And I've just started a project on this that's going to be running for this year, which is to really take that typology and begin to understand how it fits with retail organizations around the world. But also critically, I think, how do retail organizations try and measure the losses associated with those various types of causes of e-commerce? How do you put a dollar value on these things? Because that's terribly important if we're going to do this second element, which is try and do some effective benchmarking to understand the scale and extent of e-commerce losses. Because if we're not measuring it in the same way, we've seen this problem with shrinkage, haven't we? That it's often comparing apples with pears. Because retailers have adopted very different ways of measuring it. It makes it very difficult to compare and contrast between retail organizations. So I think getting that definition right and how it's calculated is very important before we go on to this next step around trying to carry out some benchmarking to understand how retail organizations are being affected by e-commerce. What is the overall cost of it? How does it relate to bricks and mortar related losses? Do you lose less through e-commerce than you do through bricks and mortar? But also, what are the most impactful forms of retail losses associated with e-commerce? What are the low-hanging fruit? What are the ones that are really causing the greatest pain? And then finally, can we really begin to see different differences in type of retail environment and the forms of e-commerce that are being experienced? So that is the research that I'm going to be taking forward and hopefully working with retailers, not only in America, but also in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand as well. So I'm going to pause there, Kevin, and that's my sort of background and context to where I've been with e-commerce, and hopefully gives us a few issues to talk about as we move forwards.
Well, absolutely, Adrian, and I think it's obviously very timely, but clearly the research is very reflective of the retail environment, right? And in the way that we have expanded out the amount of e-commerce that we're doing, and now, and in doing so, we've expanded out the opportunities for loss, to occur. Some of the numbers there are pretty incredible, and such a drain on the business and the business's opportunity for profit when it comes to some of these, not only opportunities for fraudulent returns, but as you said, the mishandling of returns, because the return rate obviously is so high when people are shopping online, and they either shopping out of convenience, or they're just shopping and then realizing they didn't get to try it on in the store. Now they've tried it on and they don't really like that color or that size or that what have you. What do you think is the biggest challenge that's facing the retail group today, in what you're seeing in your research? Is there any particular area or top couple of areas that are really standing out?
Well, I think the first thing we've got to do, Kevin, I think with this is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's the old saying, but it's very, very true, which is, what do you go after first? And if you don't actually get a sense of, well, how are we being affected by e-commerce? It may be, for instance, that, the e-commerce losses are lower than the equivalent sales that you get through bricks and mortar, because, and we just don't know. It could be that, the losses you get from thieves entering a bricks and mortar store are higher than they are from all the e-commerce fraudsters that get you online. We just really don't know that at the moment. And until we get to a point where, we've mapped out, so we understand what those losses are, and then have some capacity to measure it, it's very difficult to know what are the big problems at the moment. We certainly have seen retailers who are having major issues with returns. The problem you've got, particularly in apparel, is that we're now getting consumers who quite understandably say, well, I'm going to order 3 pairs of shoes because I'm not quite sure which are going to fit, because, that's the nature of the beast with shoes, isn't it? Until you try them on, you're never really quite sure. It's not like buying a book where you pretty know, what's on the cover you're going to get inside. And therefore, you're going to get these products coming back because of the nature of that form of retail. But will those products come back in good enough shape for you to resell at the same price that you wanted in the first place? And that's the real challenge, I think, that a lot of retailers are finding in apparel. We've heard this before, haven't we, around, the old stories around wardrobing, haven't we, where people, and I'm sure loads of experiences where people take things home for the weekend, do it, use it for whatever purpose they wanted it for, and then say, oh, I didn't actually want it, and hand it back. That product is now not fit for sale at the same price as before. And that's a real challenge, isn't it, for retailers? So, I think the issue of returns is a big issue, but, I think like a lot of types of, retail evolution, is that offenders begin to learn. And what we're finding is, we've seen this with self-scan checkouts, haven't we, where in the early days, there wasn't a lot of loss that we could find. And then the offenders are beginning to work out how they can begin to exploit the opportunity that business choice has made. And I think we're now beginning to see this with e-commerce, which is, as it grows and grows and more retailers get involved in this because they feel they have to because of competitive edge, then it begins to expose them to more opportunities, and people build up that experience level to begin to work out how they can begin to take advantage of that. And I think we're seeing that there's going to be this curve, I think, and we're seeing it, I think, with e-commerce now, where the level of loss is probably going to grow as people become more familiar with the opportunities. But we need to measure this well to understand whether that growth is happening, but also what are the vulnerabilities and what should you be trying to manage and measure first?
Adrian, if you took a look at your experience with everything that you're working on and the trends that you're seeing with this new research that you have, if you're looking at the loss prevention programs out there today, where do you think that they should be investing their resources? Where do you think that the growth really needs to take place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, e-commerce is all about data and data analytics, because as you said with this session, it's about follow the money. And for me, it's about follow the data. Yeah, and actually, what you find with e-commerce is that we are like, if I could put it like, we're like electronic slugs. We leave a trail of where we're going electronically with everything that we do, and that's to the advantage of loss prevention. Because if I was to ask to say, would you rather be trying to manage shrinkage in a bricks and mortar store or e-commerce loss? I'd always go with e-commerce loss, because the problem with shrinkage in bricks and mortar is you often don't know the cause. There's very little data because the product is just missing. And you counted it perhaps a year ago, and it's disappeared and you don't know why. Whereas at least with e-commerce, there is usually a trail of data. And therefore you've got something to begin to try and help you understand what's happened to that product and give you an opportunity to try and perhaps deter or deflect future use. The problem, of course, is it's the volume of data, isn't it? That once you open up e-commerce to the world, you're inviting tens and thousands of customers into your virtual store, whereas in a bricks and mortar store, you're probably only dealing with 100 people, or maybe in a big store perhaps 1,000 if it's a busy day. So you've got the volume of data, but for me, it's about having that data analytic capability, because that's where you're going to get the power in terms of trying to manage and control this problem.
Excellent. Well, I know that Todd, that's been a big focus for you and your program over at Lowe's, in focusing on the data and focusing on those data trails that are left behind. I know that you're pretty sleuthy when it comes to following the ORC that's happening in the stores as well. And I think what we're going to talk about next with you is how kind of those both came together and developed into a pretty sizable case, and maybe dissect the success that you had with that. Let's take those pieces apart and kind of go back through and talk about how we follow that money to get to these big cases, and in your case a big recovery as well.
Absolutely, Kevin. I appreciate the time today, and I know we're going to talk about one of our larger cases that we've had here. And normally, you don't really celebrate large cases, but this is a great example of what Adrian just talked about around data driving visibility to things that we've never seen before. And when we have technology that allows us to do that, it really does give us a success story, which I'm going to talk about today, and how we connected that between centralized support here at Lowe's at our SSC and out with our field teams in the stores to really have a collaborative strategy that ended up being very successful. So for this case, I'll just start with our initial notification. So, just like everyone in the business, really try and drive a lot of awareness out to our stores around selling behaviors, also around suspicious activity, how to get our associates to drive more business sales with our pro customers. So in this particular case, our first notification came from a pro associate who was tendering a sale for a very large wire transaction. And as they began to talk to the customer about their business, it became very evident that this person was not very knowledgeable about electrical work and wire and anything related to the product or the project that was being purchased. So that automatically drove a suspicion that the nature of the sale, the amount, the lack of knowledge, and it was reported to our local AP team. So when we took a look at the account that was presented and the check and the ID, of course, we started seeing a lot of different alert signals where, the account where it was open did not match. It was several states away. The person's ID was in a totally different state. So we kicked that up to our team here at the SSC to take a look at the data that was around this account and the sales transactions. And initially, our first thought would have been some type of possible account takeover where a customer's account had got compromised. We have fraudsters now out leveraging that throughout the country. All right, so once we got the information to the SSC and we're able to leverage the technology that we have centralized, we really began to dig into the account details. So this account showed us that the particular customer had made significant purchases over a 3-day time frame, over $100,000 of the exact same items, mostly wire, 3 different cities. So as I mentioned previously, the account was opened in 1 state. Now we've got multiple large purchases in 3 different cities. The ID of the customer did not match. And while sometimes that wouldn't be unusual, the type of product and the timeliness of these purchases did make it suspicious. So we then began to use open source data to try and verify the actual customer and the contractor account, and we were unable to do so. So there's another red flag. We leveraged our payment service provider and then was able to start connecting the dots between these suspects, these accounts, and their transactions to other accounts that were open across the US. The great thing for us then allowed us to start tracking the sales real time and start tracking the activity real time. So my fraud team here began running sales data, and that helped us to start pinpoint where in the US the activity would start. The other great thing about the technology around fraud is it gives us the ability to do 2 things. One is either engineer out the loss that's taken place, or it gives us visibility to where the loss is occurring. So if you take a look at the map here, you can see where we took both an offense and defensive approach. So we wrote rules that would engineer out the ability for the loss to occur. And then we began to open those back up to try and funnel the activity into certain geographical areas where we could work with local law enforcement and federal law enforcement to actually close the case. Because the difficulty here is if you immediately engineer out the gap, the fraudsters will move on to something else, and then you'll be chasing them and chasing them. This gave us the ability to corral them into an area of the country where we had a surveillance strategy in place, we had great communication, and we had partners to help close out the case and eventually end up with a very sizable recovery. So, as I mentioned, you can see the bright red that came along the I-85 corridor. That's where we started to funnel them in. We sent out BOLOs and communication standards all down that geographical area through the South. Those standards put very strict guidelines around mobile surveillance, communication to law enforcement, other partners we would take. And that actually resulted in us being able to have our first stop once we saw the activity happening in South Carolina. Local law enforcement responded. The initial approach that we wanted with local law enforcement was more to just gather additional intel so that we could track the suspects back to their home base. That was very fruitful. We got information on those suspects. It led to other subsequent stops and then eventually a search warrant several months later. And from that search warrant, you'll be able to see here as the video is playing. Just pause for a second.
Wow.
So I'll just stop it right there because that's quite an eyeful of a recovery. But the team couldn't have been happier when we hit the warehouse with both federal and local law enforcement. And as you can see, the strategy around tracking the sales, funneling the activity really paid off for us. So as we wrapped up the recovery here, we began to build out other splinter cells across the US, and the method of operation for this group was around placing phone orders using stolen credit card information, or opening accounts using fraudulent checks to fund the account, which later results in what Adrian was talking about with the insufficient funds and chargebacks and how that loss, different than shrink, but shows up in an expense line for the company. The total case value was just over $12 million, and we recovered $1.4 million in product. The majority of it you saw right here in this one warehouse, but there were 3 other warehouses that we had recoveries out of. And then the great part for me is that we were able to provide consequences to this organized retail crime group and the suspects, and removing them and their cash flow related to this loss really helped to stop number 5 there, because this group was tied to other illegal activities in the communities. And, you know, we're all aware that this is just like the first stop of driving income and revenue to these organized crime groups that they utilize for other things that negatively impact people's lives and communities throughout the U.S. And then finally, you know, for us at Lowe's, we try and tie everything back into the overall business. And, you know, one of our number 1 goals and mission statement is around improving our communities that we serve every single day. And then around our big 3 priorities, which for us are neat, clean, and safe stores, in stock, and customer service. And if you think about the case and how we closed this out, you know, originally it was a pro customer, we thought, buying high quantities of wire. So the fraudsters, what they end up doing is they're making these purchases, which are depleting the in-stock in the store, and then it later comes back as an expense. Well, now that product's not available for our legitimate pro customers or our DIY customers. So that impacts one of the big 3 priorities I mentioned, which is our in-stock position. And then in addition to that, if you go to the customer service perspective, is customers are only going to come back to your store so many times and you not be in stock before they decide to go to somebody else. So these fraudsters, these organized retail crime groups really impact our ability to continue to do business on a lot of different fronts. And then you think about the third one that I mentioned, neat, clean, and safe stores. These organized retail crime groups that are coming into our stores, a lot of times are violent in nature. They bring that into the stores, and the more we can do to engineer that out or keep them out of our locations, the better it is for our customers and our associates. You know, it's no news flash anymore. You see on TV all the time the smash and grabs and the runouts and the violence associated with some of these groups. And that's another negative impact to our community that I'm happy to say this is a good example of where we can actually make a difference.
You know, Adrian, I think, you know, having sat through and heard the case the way that Todd was able to identify and model it through for you, what do you see in some of the relationships between you know, what his course of action was and some of the opportunities you're seeing in your research?
It's interesting because there's with e-commerce, there's this constant balance between sales and security, which is how much friction do you want to put on the sale to check it, as opposed to letting people through who are going to be fraudulent. And that's a balance that people are building now, I think, around their risk modeling, which is to say, you know, you are a recognized customer, you've bought before, we know you're good for credit, we're going to make your online purchase straightforward, as opposed to, you know, the person here, for instance, who is throwing up red flags on the e-commerce order, where suddenly the system is going to go, you know what, should we just be letting this sale go through without some form of checking? And I think that's the interesting balance that you've got to get here, isn't it? Which is to say, at what point does the system begin to start creating friction, because we know it's going to be better for the business than not having that friction point? And I suppose I'd be interested to understand, you know, was it because at 100K in 3 days, that is remarkably unusual behavior for any business that you work with? Or what, you know, what are the triggers that you could build into your system to say, in future, this simply wouldn't be allowed to happen because our system would know that this is an anomaly that we shouldn't be allowing?
Right. So 100% agree with you, right? We design our programs and processes more for the 99.5% of our great customers than we do for the fraudsters. So this particular case, the way that we were able to handle it is we wrote rules that sent it to a queue for review. That way we didn't negatively impact the pro customer who's buying legitimately $100,000 of wire in multiple states, because that behavior in itself is not necessarily unusual. It's a combination of all the other things.
Yeah.
So once we can identify what would truly be fraud right at 100% of the time. We do have the capabilities to write rules that would automatically reject that. Those are very few and far between, and would have to carry some other type of fraudulent activity that we could confirm. Otherwise, we would take the same approach that we did here, right? Is figure out, in this particular case, like the sales, the preferred items, that gave us an indicator. Because those are such high quantity, the odds of those taking place, everywhere in the US are pretty slim. So that pinpointed down to where the activity was. And then we wrote rules more stringent in the beginning to make the activity funnel into that I-85 corridor. And then we released it once we got them funneled back in, and we're able to close the case with, our law enforcement partners.
And that, Kevin, is if there's any joys in this, that the joy of e-commerce loss issues is that you can begin to manipulate that data. You've got that data point. You were able to actually control, in some respects, this event, which would be much, much harder had that happened only in stores, where you were just, you're relying on staff saying, you know what, we've got cable missing again today. We've got cable missing again today and again, and so on. It's that capability to utilize data in ways which I think can begin to give you a better edge, I think, to try and manage this sort of issue.
And to your point with the data, actually the case and the fraudsters' activity help us build a better environment for our legitimate customers, because then we can take that data and utilize and make our pro customers VIP customers, where certain transactions they do automatically pass through because they're a known customer, a very valued customer. And so you use the data on both ends to make the programs and processes better.
Was there any reason, Todd, why they were just targeting cable? I looked at that video and you got a room full of cable. Were the thieves, did they realize that was a product that was easy to defraud you of, or, as opposed to going for power tools or some of the other more traditional ways in which you get hit by retail crime? Yep.
As we have seen activity in our stores across really all retailers, like you mentioned, tools, there's different product protection standards within tools. Some retailers, such as us, have them locked or have a dedicated associate that would service that. So there's a bigger deterrent effect. And for us, this is particularly challenged because it's a pro SKU item. So your electrical contractors who would come in and buy in bulk, we want to make it as seamless and easy for them to get it off the shelf as we can. So the securing it as you would a tool is not really an option for us, because the customer wants to come in pro, right? Time is money for them. So they want to come in and get it off the shelf and go. Yeah. In that particular instance, the type of customer really drives, what kind of standards that we would have in stores and what our programs would be to mitigate the loss, but still ensure the best customer experience that we could, for our pro. And
sorry to keep asking questions here. It's a fascinating case study. Do you find that within Lowe's that you have to build a much more cross-functional team to manage this? I'm thinking with things like credit card chargebacks is very much a sort of a finance issue, isn't it? And then here you are in loss prevention, getting different data sources, and often you might have customer service who again have a different point. Do you find you have to work more strategically across the business when dealing with these sorts of issues?
Yeah, absolutely, because the different parts of the business that the chargebacks, right, or these losses could impact from, mentioned online, but credit card, check chargebacks, all those. And so we work collaboratively across, our SSC team here, not just in assets protection, but across all other parts of the business. And then with our field assets, across the country, because still, like from an AP standpoint, our largest asset is still out in the field as far as AP staff members or controls in the stores. So now is the opportunity to leverage both to fight a good fight for our pro customers, right, and our legitimate customers, and fight a good fight against the fraudsters. And you've seen it really escalate over the last couple of years. You see organized retail crime groups that would generally be in stores, creating shrink that you mentioned before, moving to other avenues that make it a little more anonymous and a little easier at times to be able to create it without that friction in the store. When you think about folks that would come in and steal or take tools, as you mentioned, whether they were walking out It's a very emotional thing for an associate in the store to see, right? And there's so many other types of loss that associates don't see, but to have someone come in and take it right off the shelf without paying for it is very emotional. So that drives certain behaviors that we want to get away from as well from a service standpoint. But, you know, writing a bad check, fraudulent credit card, for an associate ringing up a transaction, that doesn't look very much different from a legitimate customer to a fraudster. So it passes through. Luckily, in this case, our associate was modeling great selling behaviors, asking questions on how we could continue to drive their business until we found out we don't want to drive their particular business. We want to drive legitimate business. So, but it's a great combination of our associates in the stores asking the right questions to drive the right behaviors, and then being aware enough when something seems suspicious to report it. And then let's leverage both centralized and decentralized programs.
Or driving that behavior to the I-85 corridor, apparently, and and letting it happen so that our law enforcement partners can step in and help us dismantle the network. So that was excellent. So Adrian, Todd, thank you both very much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And I think we're going to transition now over to a little bit of live Q&A. So thank you both for your time. And we look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Todd, we'll see you in a minute.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Or maybe a minute or less. So questions. We do have Todd on with us at the moment. So if you have any questions that you'd like to throw in the Q&A for Todd, please do so. Jack, do you have any on your end?
Yeah, I've got a few. Let's start with a basic one here, just real quick here. Todd, we'll just call it a lot of wire. Where was it going? Was it going into a diversion program, or what was the intent for all that wire?
So they had a couple ways of moving it, right through online marketplaces, selling it within, you know, the local contracting community, places like that. So they had, I mean, these are sophisticated businesses, just like Lowe's, just like, you know, other retailers out there. So they have an online presence, plus they have, you know, Adrian mentioned bricks and mortars. So, you know, some had, you know, shops where they were selling it out of. So it's just as sophisticated of a retail network as what many of us on the in this business have.
Okay, let's talk about the law enforcement aspect of this. I mean, engaging law enforcement and making them understand this kind of case and explaining the different aspects of how you reached your conclusions and so forth. It's obviously a much different type of case. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. One, we pride ourselves on our relationships in the communities, just as being part of Lowe's, and then also in the communities and working with our first responders and law enforcement. And I couldn't tell you how valuable that was, the relationships that we've built in things other than just cases, things like natural disasters, things like community events, all aspects of improving our community. So those relationships went a long way. But in this particular case, Adrian had mentioned that, you know, I think he called it a digital slug, right? Is that, you know, this e-commerce and fraud and chargebacks leaves a digital trail that actually made it pretty easy for us to connect the dots and explain how the losses are occurring financially for Lowe's. You know, if I think about checks and I think about fraudulent credit cards, things like that, those are concepts that they really understand and can put the pieces together. Then, like I said, when we had our first stop, we gathered additional intelligence from that first stop, the pieces really started to fall into place. And I really couldn't, I mean, this particular case was only around Lowe's. A lot of times, you know, we work with other retailers and we have great relationships with what would generally be called a competitor, but in instances like shrink, in instances like total retail loss or safety, we're not competitors. We're all working for the same thing. So we're able to, in other instances, leverage relationships that maybe other folks have built and tie in our law enforcement partners. So yeah, this one worked out really well.
Okay, I think we've got time here for one more. things have changed a lot over the past several years for retail as a whole, and LP has had to adjust to those changes. You made a lot of adjustments over the course of this type of case while staying within your three pillars, or what, I can't remember the exact term you used, but can you comment on that a little bit more about how your department has really had to adjust considering everything that we've gone through over the last several years?
Yeah. So I think you're referring to our big three priorities at Lowe's, and that's really what we drive in our stores every single day. And, you know, I mean, at Lowe's, every bit of work that we do should be attached to driving execution of those big three or helping to drive our mission statement. And when you think about our asset protection team, we're critical parts of the business. I mean, we own and drive the bottom line performance of the company, and we're heavily invested in like those relationships that I mentioned, not with just law enforcement, but in our communities. Like, we're all encouraged to be a part of that. So we always think about what we do and how we do it and how does it help drive those priorities and our mission statement. If it doesn't, then we're probably focused on the wrong thing, and we need to adjust our programs and processes to get back on track with the things that matter the most. Because it's very easy in AP to get focused on a lot of things and do them 75, 80, 90%, but whenever you really push it down to the most important things related to the business, it really helps to drive value from our department and our people, and help to really make the overall company successful.
Well, Todd, we have a lot of great questions here, but unfortunately, we're running a little short on time. We could talk about this all day, I think. Congratulations to you and your team. Great job.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the time.
Excellent. Todd, if you can do me a favor, maybe you can open up the chat. There are a couple of questions in there that you could just type answer to live right in there while we move on to the next session. And that way we don't leave anybody stranded. There's one that marked as answered that you can type the answer to as well. And then there's two open ones there for you as well. That would be awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So moving forward, we've got our next session here, follow the money. Now we're going to go to the outside job where we're working with financial institutions and law enforcement to identify and dismantle these organized crime networks. And joining us today is Tom Welch. He's the unit chief for the financial crimes unit within HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. We've got Lauren Kaur, who is the senior director of anti-money laundering with ACAMS, and Tiffany Polyak, who is also with ACAMS. She's a project coordinator and researcher. So welcome to our panel. We did have advertised that Al Giangregorio was going to be with us today. If you were here to see Al, I'm afraid you're going to have to settle for us stepping up a notch to Tom and bringing Tom in. We brought in the A team. Al actually had a last minute conflict with a case and couldn't be here, but we're very excited to have Tom because, let's face it, Tom was going to do a better job anyways. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Lauren, so you ladies can share yours.
Absolutely. Tiffany's going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to stay off camera just for bandwidth reasons while I present, and then I'll come back on for the Q&A. But thank you so much, Kevin, and all that are joining us for the opportunity today. On the next slide, you'll see myself and Tiffany, who will be presenting again. My name is Lauren Kaur. I'm the Senior Director of AML at ACAMS, and joining me will be my colleague, Tiffany Polyak. She's Project Coordinator Researcher at ACAMS as well. For those that aren't familiar with, ACAMS is a global association of certified anti-money laundering specialists. We're in 180 countries with over 190,000 members. We are the largest global membership organization that's dedicated to fighting financial crime. And the focus really of ACAMS is to enhance the knowledge and skills of our members, which primarily include financial institutions, regulatory authorities, law enforcement agencies, and like industry sectors. So as we transition to the next slide, and we really kind of understand why is ACAMS sitting on this webinar and how did we get here? It really is, as I mentioned, we have over 190,000 members. Primarily, a lot of those are financial institutions. And when you look and think about to what extent can financial institutions help play in ORC, I'm hoping to lay that out for you today. When HSI approached us in partnering and in bringing awareness to financial institutions about ORC, at first I was like, what is the problem? What's the size? And as we've really worked through this over the past several weeks, it's become quite significant. I saw recently a RELA statistic where I believe it was like pre-COVID, there was 68.9 billion worth of products were stolen in retailers in 2019, and over 125, or 125.7 billion lost in economic activity. And when I look at that previously before joining a financial, or before joining ACAMS, I was at a financial institution. I'm looking at all that money is being laundered through financial institutions. And what are financial institutions doing to detect that? So really what's bringing us to the table is how can we educate our financial institution partners globally, primarily in the US is where we serve, but globally on ORC. And what can we do? And what was really interesting in listening to Todd's presentation, it's coming from a different lens and a different viewpoint, what I would almost consider kind of the front end of investigations. And we're looking at it from the back end, the money flow of it, but a lot of the terminology, a lot of the challenges, when you have a legitimate customer versus a fraudster, that's the same challenges financial institutions see as well. So my goal today is really to help all of you who may be investigating ORC from a different perspective, kind of see the value in following the money and the back end side of it, and understand how you can really gain some financial intelligence from following the money. And also, as well as we begin to educate financial institutions on this, on organized retail crime, how we're going to be enriching law enforcement with additional information. So, a little bit of background. So how do financial institutions follow the money? And as I walk through this, I'm going to ask you to kind of keep the lens on is how could this information be beneficial to an ORC investigation? So what does it look like? So all financial institutions, banks, when I say that primarily, some money service businesses must comply with AML and CTF regulations, primarily what's called the Bank Secrecy Act. And they must comply with that. So what does that look like? Well, we could have many webinars on what that means, but some areas that I see that really would highlight how this could help ORC is they must know your customer. So you'll see on to the right side of my slide, and know your rooster, know your fencer. So when a customer comes in to open an account, a bank must take their name, their date of birth, their social security, tax ID number, and a physical address. And then they must verify the accuracy of that. So putting kind of the lens on the ORC, if you're having a individual fencer, booster, kingpin, whatever, tied up in this ORC, a financial institution will have that information. Similar to what Todd was talking about, it was music to my ears when you were talking about transaction monitorings and building rules and typologies. Financial institutions have a very similar mechanism that they use to detect suspicious activity. So whether that's human trafficking, terrorism, weapons smuggling, WMD, whatever it may be, financial institutions have software that sits on their core systems where they build rules and typologies that will alert them both, to potential fraudulent activity as well as potential money laundering activity. And really in the lens that we're talking about today is the money laundering side of it. Similar to the other side, financial institutions have massive, you look at the big guys like the B of A and the Wells Fargo, they'll have 600, 700, 800 financial crime investigators. You look at maybe a smaller community bank, near one of your retailers, they may have 3 or 4, but each financial institution is going to have a set group that's going to be investigating suspicious activity. And then also similar to the retailers, we do have public-private partnerships in which we work with law enforcement, and then we work with other financial institutions. Really, how we effectively detect and report that information is through partnerships. Two ways that we do this is banks can share information with another bank. So let's say, for example, we thought Todd was, involved in ORC, and he was laundering those proceeds tied to potential illicit activity. And he was, he had a bank account at my bank, and arbitrary name, let's say, Bank B, he was sending money to, if I could reach out to Bank B under certain circumstances and say, hey, what kind of activity is Todd doing? Do you think, are you seeing anything suspicious? Depending on that, that might kind of supplement my investigation. All with the end result being, if I feel there's suspicious activity, I'm going to file what they call a suspicious activity report. And this is the mechanism in which financial institutions alert the government. Particularly, they file it through FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is our global governing body. Let them know, hey, Tom from HSI, this is, we think this is suspicious. And so you can kind of see right there, this is at the very, very basic level, but you can see where, financial institutions have this opportunity as we begin to bring this awareness and educate them to detect and report this activity to help law enforcement. So as we transition to the next slide, what I want to talk about is why do we think it's important? And really a lot of this is just to start bringing some awareness to this. So of course, following the money and when financial institutions are putting these programs and these typologies and these rules in place that may or may not be or may be indicative of illicit activity. And one thing to note is we've started building out some of these typologies and working with Tom's team on understanding how are they moving the money. These typologies aren't really that different than other criminal portfolios that you're looking at, whether it's human trafficking, human smuggling, weapons trafficking, whatever it may be. A lot of times, and Tiffany's going to get into it, they're laundering the money in the same fashion. So I think where the gap is right now is that financial institutions may be alerted to this money or this type of activity, but they don't know that that's what they're looking at. They don't know, or they don't realize that this is actually ORC activity, that this is just another line of business in a criminal portfolio. So that's really where we're going to try and step in and help. But the reason for this is, the benefit being, or why it's important to follow it, is you're really going to be able to start seeing the breadth of the criminal networks or the size and the organizational structure of the ORC or organized threat group. We're still learning the terminology, so bear with me. As well as it really can enhance investigations and most importantly, start building a picture and building a network and who's transacting money with who and who's emailing who and who's sharing accounts, who are true signers on a financial institution account. And you can really start building financial profiles. And what do I mean by financial profiles? On the other side, on the second slide of my presentation, you'll see, so let's say I'm a fencer and I'm sending a wire. And, what do I want to understand? Okay, below you'll see an example wire form. And this is what a financial institution, if I have an account in a financial institution, I may go in and I will fill out this information in advance of sending a wire. So let's say the fencer is kind of in the middle between the boosters and I'll call it the kingpin or something. And they send money to the boosters, they send money to the cleaners, and my apologies in advance if I'm using the wrong terminology, but kingpin. So what you'll see there is, John Smith is the fencer and he's sending money to Fred Taylor. Well, from a financial perspective and trying to understand the depth and the size of this network and where's the money going, well, right there you can make a connection. John and Fred are involved in ORC. Now, some red flags, Fred is located in New York City is where his physical address is. It's suspicious that he has his bank account possibly in Texas. Same thing with John Smith, that's his physical address. And then, but he has his account is in Miami, Florida. Now, one thing to note is like what I talked about in the beginning in the previous slide where I was saying, know your fencer, know your booster, is that these addresses that at least on the customer side that they're putting on have been verified. So they've been subject to what we call a customer identification program. So we verified, as I previously stated, their names, their date of birth, their address, and their tax ID. So we to the extent possible, this is who the individual is. Now, that being said, we know that fraud is rampant as well. So I hope what we're seeing in here is we're kind of talking about what financial institutions do and what financial institutions see is that from your perspective, you can really see the breadth and wealth of financial intelligence that can be gained and really how you can start building out these networks. As we transition to the next slide. So I know this is a lot to digest, and don't worry, I'm not going to go in detail on each one. And you can see by following the people at a high level, it is just the ORC process that we're all familiar with. But what I wanted to touch or to talk about you about with is some touch points based off where banks may have AML programs or anti-financial crimes programs, where they can detect what might be identified as potential ORC activity. So for example, if you have the fencer, they're paying boosters in cash. Their bank statement would obviously show, a significant amount of cash withdrawals, potentially cash deposits if the boosters are doing it. And what can a bank do to detect that? Well, banks can establish within their transaction monitoring system and their software certain rules and typologies that could alert them to increase cash withdrawal. Similar as we move down, move down it, we have the booster. So let's say booster payments, the fencer account would show frequent cash withdrawals, and the booster may show frequent cash deposits. Bank would, or the fencer has set up a diverter business where they're cleaning these goods, or even shell companies, which is a lot of what we've been seeing in talking with the different agents on these companies, is they're setting up shell companies. And what a shell company is, if you're not familiar with, it's just whether it's a storefront and the goods are actually moving through it, or it's a company that's just being set up so it looks like the financials can move through the bank account. But what a financial institution may be able to be alerted to is when they're opening up an account, depending on what type of account it is or what they say the type of business is. They may be able to identify by a NACE's code, or it might have right off the bat a red flag for being a shell company. As we kind of move through some red flags, they might see frequent charges on mailroom statements. They might see typically what I would think you would see too as well in a shell business would be, you would see a lot of sales coming in. So, as we move through, we might see a lot of credits coming in from online marketplaces, but you're not going to see any either purchasing of goods or any sort of manufacturing type transactions that would be related to creating of the goods. So it'd really just be the goods out. I think that'd be a pretty quick red flag that it might be tied to ORC. A lot of ways that financial institutions can begin to evolve their AFC programs or anti-financial crimes programs would be they could do comparisons. So if I have a shell company or I have a business that I've set up and it's being used to be as a shell company, and it's, when I'm going through and doing what they call customer due diligence. So I'm not sure if anyone on this call or this webinar has opened up an account recently, but it's not, you don't open an account without having a number of questions asked about, what type of business are you? What type of transactions are you going to do? You pretty much have to give your DNA at some point to do that, but that's all kind of the know your customer. And so when these banks are opening up these accounts and saying, okay, well, I'm in a warehouse and I sell all my products online marketplace. Well, a financial institution can take that typology and start comparing it against other like businesses. And if, let's say, that business has a significant more transactions or significant larger dollar amount to them, that might start showing some different variances to them that this could be indicative of ORC. So, as you just kind of think through all of this, there's just such significant opportunities where banks, I think, can really start combating this. And I think that's where we're really excited to kind of help and work with HSI on getting this out there, because there's, in listening from Kevin and Todd as these cases, I'm hoping we can really help build this on the back end. But one of the things as I transition to Tiffany is I've really given the perspective of the, transaction, the point, the visual, the point in time. So a cash transaction, this is what it would look like if they did a wire transaction. But I think it's important to know is that these individuals actually have to launder their money. They have to make these illicit funds look legitimate. And how do they do that? So Tiff, if you could just take a few minutes and walk us through how they might do this and how they're leveraging marketplaces, I think that'd be of value.
Yeah, of course. So I guess I'll just start with just the basics of money laundering in case some of you watching are not necessarily familiar with the process and how maybe ORC criminals might use this process. So to start, knowing now what Lauren said, banks can detect, investigate, and report these suspicious transactions. So in determining the typologies, I usually find it useful to think of myself as a criminal, or in this case, as a diverter or a kingpin. So your first step would be determining how you would place these illicit proceeds, or as we call them, dirty money, into the financial system without it getting flagged. You could do this by breaking down transactions into smaller dollar amounts to evade these reporting requirements. You can do that through smurfing or even money mules. Another way you can do it is setting up a front company. Where you can then process these illicit funds and commingle them to make them seem legitimate. And then once you get these funds placed into the financial system, a good criminal will then hide them from further detection. And then that process is layering. So the goal here of layering is to disconnect or hide the original dirty money to make it more difficult to prove that the original money is from criminal proceeds. So generally, the more layers that the money passes through, the harder it is to connect the funds back to that criminal activity. A lot of complex layering schemes will involve sending money overseas and using a series of transactions. And the more countries the money enters and leaves, the harder it is to uncover than the original source of the money. It can also involve electronic transactions like wires, or it can involve paper transactions by using covert means. In the US, an OTG group may layer transactions through multiple shell companies or with multiple bank accounts, even using community banks or offshore accounts that don't necessarily have the same BSA AML, that don't necessarily have the same teams. So then once the money is properly layered, it will then enter this final phase in integration. And here the money is then placed into legitimate businesses or personal investments. It may be used to purchase high-end luxury goods or such as jewelry or automobiles. And it may even be used to create another business entity that then this group can use to launder even more money. Because these OTG syndicates have hidden the sources and disconnected the funds from its original criminal proceeds, it can be very difficult to prove or flag that these groups are then laundering and using dirty money to buy these goods. So now, after the money has been cleaned, they can profit off their crimes and buy all these luxury vehicles or invest in properties. So then moving on, as COVID-19 has really encouraged buyers to start purchasing goods online, especially with the brick and mortar store closures, it's important to analyze all the risks from online marketplaces. So criminals quickly adapted to the online world, as you all know, from being experts in the retail industry. And online marketplaces are then ripe for ORC to use transaction or ghost laundering. So walking through this process that you can see on my screen at a high level, the one listed here would be more used for exclusive goods or designer that aren't necessarily everyday, but the process is still similar. For an everyday good, they would have this stolen merchandise. The criminal would then set up this online store on the marketplace. And then of course, just through normal means selling this good and then shipping it to the buyer. But if it's a designer good or maybe more exclusive, and it'd be pretty obvious that the criminal stole it, you could see that the buyer maybe would hide what it truly was on the online marketplace and maybe have a code for it and then send the code to this buyer. But that would definitely be more of a complex scheme. It's important to note that some of these store merchants may be unverified or maybe even anonymous, depending on the online marketplace it is. And from a financial institute perspective, legitimate transactions would look no different than an illicit transaction. So it would make it very difficult to detect. But what a financial institution will see is either a PayPal credit or some sort of incoming deposit, and they will not know necessarily if it was tied to a stolen good or not. So then there's also the process of masking the criminal's true identity, which you can see in this red flag in the corner. They may use PayPal or crypto to further mask the transition and the identity. Moving on to this. So the diagram on this slide shows some ways that third-party payment processors or peer-to-peer payment networks can commonly mask an identity. So these types of networks may not necessarily be subject to BSA and AML requirements. So you do not have regular financial institution monitoring, detecting, or reporting of some suspicious activity. And as you can see, some of these do have, they require bank account information, like Cash App. And some do have identity requirements where you would need to show, an ID or social security number. But other ones only need a name, an email, a phone number, and an address, which, as you can assume, you can pretty easily commit fraud or identity theft in order to do this, or just come up with, a fake email. I've also noticed during research that there is a crypto function now with PayPal, Venmo, and Cash App. So I think, we are still researching to what extent that organized retail crime groups have been leveraging crypto. But as you can imagine, crypto would definitely increase anonymity, especially through privacy coins and mixers, privacy wallets, and even things like chain hopping. There's also an important note here that the IRS recently came up with a new reporting requirement, which would be if you spend $600, then you then have to report it. But of course, it depends on the product. And if you're using things like razor blades or, different types of makeup, it would definitely not be $600. So it would not have to be reported. It's also important to note that when it goes to the financial institution, then through these payment processors, that the banks might have a hard time identifying who the beneficial ownership really belongs to, or understanding what the reason for the transaction was. And then, so with this, it would be attractive for a criminal to use online marketplaces or PayPal or, Venmo, Cash App, just because they don't have the same type of customer identification requirements that banks would. And it definitely is an easier way to commit identity theft and mask your true identity and hiding the money. So then I'll go to my last slide. Just to conclude on my end, due to the nuances of emerging tech and increased privacy, following the money is super important in catching the higher level kingpins and taking down the bigger syndicates. And to combat this, awareness raising and strengthening public-private partnership will definitely enhance investigations and assist in taking down these larger groups. I'll stop. All right.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Tiffany. And thank you, Lauren. Definitely appreciate that. And, it's interesting because, this relationship that we've started with you guys and the opportunities that we've had in connecting you with the retailers so that they can not only understand this process better, but be able to help you all work with the financial institutions to take those models that they have today that are built around identifying drug trafficking, identifying human trafficking, right? And now using similar models to identify possible ORC, right? And then working with the retailers, working with law enforcement, like Tom and his team at HSI, right? To be able to identify and dismantle these groups. So hopefully, we can see the sort of the crossover there. It's kind of not too dissimilar to what Todd was doing, right? With identifying the patterns, identifying how it works, finding those bad actors, and then funneling them into an area and into a method of activity that the way you want it to be done so that you can build your case and then deliver it. So thank you for bringing all that to the table for us. I think that was really, really helpful. Tom, unfortunately, I didn't leave a lot of time for you, but what I am going to ask, if anybody has any question and answer, because I know we're going to run short on time. If you have any questions, put them in the chat in the Q&A, and Tiffany and Lauren, if you can go into the Q&A and maybe answer those, you can type the answers into folks right there while we jump over to Tom and cover some of the HSI side. So Tom?
Yeah, and I've spoken to this group before, I think a couple months ago. So I'm sort of like the Tom Hanks, if this is Saturday Night Live, like this is my second presentation. So,
Well, when you get to 5, we'll give you the LPM jacket when you get to 5.
That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see, share. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. I've got the PowerPoint presentation here queued up. I'm gonna really fly through it. I apologize. I think some of you have seen this before, so won't get too much into all this. We always like to say who we are at HSI. Second largest federal agency nationwide. 7,500 agents roughly. Support staff. So I think we're probably well over 10,000 total employees. And we're all across the US. We have a lot of responsibilities. Look, I'm a money laundering guy. That's my 30 years of law enforcement experience has been money laundering. I'm now over the financial crimes unit. So anything that has a financial component within HSI, I'm at HSI headquarters, responsible for cryptocurrency, all the stuff we're talking about, narcotics, money laundering, fraud, large scale fraud, transnational criminal organizations. Really, HSI is in a position where we pride ourselves. We're protecting U.S. citizens against transnational criminals, and most all of our, activity in this arena, in our HSI mission is to protect, the integrity of the financial institutions and protecting our retailers. So this really fell right where we needed to. So I think this is an update from when we talked about a month and a half ago. I think we mentioned we were going to start an operation, and what that really means is it just is a focus. It's a focus on retail crime and organized retail crime in particular, and so that allows us to, identify cases that fall within the category, to make efforts to track progress in this fight against it. It's really a reporting mechanism. So we called it Operation Boiling Point. We let one of the program managers who, we came up to headquarters to help us out in this fight. He'd worked a really good case out of Houston, Texas on organized retail crime. So he got to name it. I said, why Boiling Point? He said, he just felt like the organized retail crime had reached its boiling point, and it has. Probably if Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine, which is a whole other world for me. I think the earliest I stopped work this week was about 11 o'clock. We're hiring usajobs.gov if you're interested in any. We have a lot of loss prevention guys in our ranks, but it's just been a busy week. And besides the invasion of Ukraine, organized retail crime had been capturing the headlines for a solid, 2-3 months, pretty heavily. And whether it be a one-time event, an overrunning of a store, or, the overall organized retail crime, and its uptick and its trend in the United States has been a big deal. So we're on top of it. I'm going to talk is perfect. I love ACAMs. They're so, first off, I've never met anyone from ACAMs that you don't automatically like. Secondly, their graphics are fantastic. What a beautiful presentation. I love, and it's almost academic. It makes it seem like my job is, could be studied by a professor like Lauren, like she's a professor of money laundering. I love it. I'll just say, these are what we do. This is my job. It's actually the only fun thing I really like to do. I'm re-engineering or reverse engineering, how things moved. So what I do is I take a population of cases and I found out how they move their money, because there's not a crime in the federal government. I always say there's 2 examples, but every crime in the federal government is motivated by money. Bad guys want to make money. So, ever since Moses was a teenager, people have been stealing things. In fact, I think Old Testament wise, what's theft? It's definitely in the top 10, right? So thou shalt not. And so theft has always been an issue. Obviously, stealing and moving out of the country has always been an issue. I've experienced cars, cell phones, those are the really common items. I've seen high level watches, your luxury watches. That's another popular thing that moves, diamonds, gold, those type of things. But what's interesting is even this transition to the smaller over-the-counter items, and the volume at which they're stolen. And I think we've learned a lot in even our refurbishing of this program. I think we can really do some damage. And damage to the bad guys, and really help our retailers. And they need it. Like Lauren was quoting those $68 billion numbers and 125 billion, with employee injury and all, and this extra security required to maintain a retail establishment. That's difficult. And then if you add high inflation, it's a tough time right now for retailers. So, we want to help. That's what America's all about, and that's what we're here to do. I'll say this is some of what we've learned on our reverse engineering. I'll say with draws, typically bad guys, especially most other crimes, are always trying to put money in. Now, granted, obviously, if you're selling a bunch of merchandise to a fence and they're paying you cash, that person's going to go ahead and deposit their cash into their bank account. Sometimes, otherwise, they're going to live off the grid or buy gift cards or money orders. But what we're focusing on, this is like the middleman. So the cash withdrawals. So this is to a bank is going to look like an otherwise legitimate business. They may even be called wholesaler. They may be called liquidator, something. And maybe part of their business model is buying liquidated merchandise. So that's something that we've looked at. So the cash withdrawals is interesting. And that one's hit. Every big ORC case that we've had nationwide so far has followed that model with large structured cash withdrawals. So when we say structured, they're trying to avoid that $10,000 IRS notification if they withdraw $10,000 in cash. Now, the interesting thing about withdrawals compared to deposits, a lot of time deposits, and back in the old days, it could be anonymous. Withdrawals obviously is coming from someone's account. So there's really no anonymity. It's really, what are you spending that money on? If you're a gambler or, those are typical things we'd see. I'd see tax evasion. I can tell, if I can't do it today, I don't have enough time, but I can tell you some fun stories about Sun City, Arizona, where they're withdrawing lots of cash. Always good stories. But anyway, so, it's a little bit uncommon. So that's something that we're finding. Then obviously the other things are pretty much normal, like, rapid movement of cash to states. I will say we're starting to consolidate. We're starting to really find these large scale sellers, and they're starting to really stand out too. So once you have a lot of product going to one location, that's usually a clue that we're really on the right track. So that's been helpful. There's a lot of similarities there. I'll say payments or wire transfers to multiple liquidator wholesale companies. That's pretty common. Outgoing checks, checks written on business account payable to cash and deposited in the principal's personal accounts. These are some type of other activities, but this is what we're really, exercising right now, these typologies, because that's going to be overall part of our large ORC plan. I like this. I just saw Ben Dugan from CVS gave a presentation. We had a coming to headquarters meeting last week, and I just really enjoyed this. Obviously, I think he's probably done a presentation or he's part of this group, but it's just showing the levels of ORC and how, some of these lower box stores, but have a larger economic impact. And then some of the high dollar items of the smash and grabs, they ultimately have a violence high impact, but a low dollar impact. That's really kind of affecting how, we look at it. I think it's also modeling how people across the country are looking at ORC. I did the super condensed version of this understanding. I think it's more important that we answer questions. So here's my contact information. If you want to hear any more stories, or you have good leads, or you want to apply to HSI, well, I'll say this: go to usajobs.gov. But for any other phone call, go ahead and reach out, hit me on an email. We are going through a lot of leads right now. It's been a very busy time. I think this is, let me see, am I back live? Can you see my face? There we go.
There we go.
So how was that? Am I true like a true TV professional? I had my 10 minutes and I did it.
You got your 10 minutes of fame, Tom. Good job. And it was way better than Al could have done, I'm sure. But no, thank you very much for putting all that together. I think as you said, it's a very busy time, right? We're, and we're looking at ORC in a way that we haven't looked at before, and we're making partnerships that we haven't had before. I mean, even HSI, Tom, if you look back just 2 years ago, going further than 2-3 years ago, you didn't hear HSI. You heard, you heard FBI on occasion, you heard Secret Service once in a while, but and you heard about these big cases that happen 1, 2, maybe 3 times a year. And right now you've probably got, easily a dozen going on in the background, and a dozen more leads to still follow up on. I know down here in Florida, we just spent 2 days with Broward County Sheriff's Office, and Broward County down here is number 3 in the U.S. for ORC, and we just found one of the major retailers here. Their number 3 store in the country for ORC is located right up the street from here. It's pretty incredible on how rampant this is going, and it's so wonderful to see the amount of resources that you guys have put behind this, and then expand that partnership out to include, folks like Lauren and Tiffany from ACAMS. The amount of information that we can all start to collect and share, which is also something we hadn't done before. As Adrian said earlier on, we used to be in a data desert, and now we're overwhelmed with this data, but what do we do with it? And if we don't have partners like you guys to be able to help us manage that, then we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to make any big difference with this epidemic, that we have right now in ORC. So
Yeah, absolutely.
thank you guys for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Again, if there's any other questions, throw them in the Q&A for us, and we will absolutely try to get to those. We are running short on time, and I don't want to take anybody too long. So just a real quick thank you again to our sponsor, Detective Analytics. Again, without folks like Dean and his team at Detective Analytics, we wouldn't be able to do sessions like this. So please check out Detective Analytics and visit and even just see to set up a demo with them, because the product they have is remarkable and is making a real impact in helping businesses follow the money. Subscribe today to LP Magazine if you haven't already. Don't forget to download the LP portal to get connected to just about everything loss prevention, AP, and safety. And don't forget, next week, voting opens on the lphall.com for all those big categories. So hopefully you got your nominations in and you're going to vote on your nominees. The nominees should be out next week. The judging is almost done to put I think it's the top 3 or 4 for each category out there. So stay tuned. And that will do it for today's session. So thank you again to Adrian, to Todd, Lauren, Tiffany, Tom. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jack, for joining today as well. We appreciate you all, and we hope to see you all again soon. So thank you, everyone, and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.